When their cover is blown and their idyllic suburban family life is destroyed, it's up to former spies Jamie Foxx and Cameron Diaz to get back in action. Let me know down in the comment section what you guys thought of this action comedy. I'm Brennan and Tory for the New Wave Nerds. Subscribe down below for more nerd content and commentary. Now let's roll the intro. Alright, so I'm going to begin things by doing a little non-spoiler review. So this is definitely a fun movie. It's certainly enjoyable. Not likely to be the best movie of the year, likely not to be in the running whatsoever, almost certainly not going to even be the best action comedy movie of the year, but nonetheless, it is very fun. There's some decent comedy in here. Some of the action is interesting. I like the use, in any spy movie, I like when we get some improvised weaponry here, and this movie I think does that in a fairly decent way. It's certainly enjoyable. I like a lot of the themes that we explore throughout this, but it's obviously not going to be the best movie of the year. Hopefully this is not the best that we see from, like, say, Jamie Foxx or Cameron Diaz this year. There were some awkward line reads, but the comedy was decent. It's certainly a good popcorn flick, and so if that's the type of movie you enjoy, or if you're just looking for something to watch, turn your brain off, and have a fun night, then I would definitely recommend Back in Action, currently available on Netflix. Now, this movie is directed by Seth Gordon, and it is co-written by Seth Gordon and Brendan O'Brien. It stars Jamie Foxx, Cameron Diaz, McKenna Roberts, Rylan Jackson, Kyle Chandler, Glenn Close, Jamie Demetriou, I'm not 100% sure there, I'm sorry, and Andrew Scott. Now, I do enjoy the cast here. Like I said, there are a few clunky line reads. There are a few moments that necessarily aren't acted well. Some of the ones that stick out to me are particularly from Cameron Diaz. But when we get into the child actors, there's obviously a little bit more leeway that's going to be granted there. I felt like McKenna Roberts, the daughter of Jamie Foxx and Cameron Diaz, did a decent job. Rylan Jackson, I think, did good for the most part, but my main complaint with him simply comes from the fact that it appears he only has one facial expression for every single emotion, and it's this sort of half smile, which, don't get me wrong, is a good smile, but when you're supposed to be screaming and freaking out and your voice is in, this classic prepubescent teen screech, maybe don't have the half smile. But that being said, I think they did a good job. I enjoyed the family unit here, and I really enjoyed the performances from Kyle Chandler and Andrew Scott. I liked Andrew Scott's character to the extent that I wish we had seen more of him. It feels like his time on screen is not utilized very well. He is just there to be there and to provide another conflict in the story. There's not much emotional, what's the word I'm trying to use here? It's basically one note. It's basically one note, and so I wish we had seen more of him. I'm a big fan of Andrew Scott. I haven't seen him in much, but he was the main character in the Netflix Ripley series, which longtime listeners may remember I did a weekly fixation on a very long time ago, back when the weekly fixation was still a format that we regularly did when we were reporting more news and less reviews. So go and give that a listen if you're interested. But I like the actor, and I wish we had seen more of his character throughout this. It felt, like I said, one-sided, a little one-note, and I think that's a failure of the writing more than a failure of the actor, right? Anytime he's on screen, it seems like he's bored, like he doesn't want to be there, and maybe that's a choice. Maybe it's a choice, but it felt a little bit like he was just being underutilized. And like I said, I like the actor. I'm not a huge fan of that. But now let's get into the actual meat of the movie here. Let's get into the spoiler section. So this is your final warning. Again, the movie is available on Netflix. If you don't want to be spoiled, then go watch the movie and come back. This video will probably still be here. Almost certainly. I can imagine no reason the video would be taken down, but in any case, I believe I have filibustered long enough, so let's get into things. Now, like I said, I enjoyed the family unit throughout this. Obviously, in any movie where the importance of family is a central theme, I'm always going to be a little bit biased towards that because I think it is an important theme and a laudable theme, and something that has sort of been almost cast by the wayside a little bit in recent years. It feels like lately there has been much less of an importance placed on the family and the family unit in a lot of these films, and so I'm glad that we get to see that. And again, I think it's done in a decent way. I think the family more or less has good chemistry with each other. More or less, obviously, there are some awkward parts, but the relationship between Cameron Diaz's Emily and McKenna Roberts' Alice is fairly interesting. It's a plight that I would imagine, again, having no kids myself, I have no personal experience here, but I imagine it's a feeling that every parent experiences at least at some point, and again, generally in the teenage years. At this point, I believe the daughter is supposed to be 14, and you know, the mother and daughter are drifting apart, right? The daughter, again, she's reaching these teenage years. She's in high school. She is beginning to attempt to try to become her own person and building up this little bit of resentment towards her mother, which, again, is an incredibly common plight as far as I understand it. And I think a lot of the chemistry between those two, when they're combative, is actually really good. I feel like, again, I don't know if the writing is necessarily amazing, but the performances of McKenna Roberts and Cameron Diaz, I think, are done well enough that it sort of makes up a little bit for that. Now, on the writing, and as it pertains to the children, I do have this to say as a good rule of thumb and a warning to all future filmmakers anywhere ever. If you are an adult and you are writing for a part for a child, do not try to include modern slang. Do not try to appeal to what you think is the current culture, okay? Because it is not. It is not. Whatever you think is going on in Gen Z right now, it is not, okay? And I don't mean that as a slight, okay? Because I am in Gen Z, but I'm terminally online, but not terminally online in the way that most of the people in my generation are. Most of my time is spent doing comic books, reading comic books and research on movies. So I am not in tune with the sort of modern Gen Z internet culture, and I am aware of that. I'm aware of that. But when you have somebody who is, let's see, when was this guy born? When was Seth Gordon born? 1974. He's a year older than my dad. And let's see, who was the other guy? Brendan O'Brien. Let's see, another 70s baby. There is no birth date on IMDb. But if I had to guess, the latest this guy was born is probably 1984. There's nothing on Wikipedia either. So he's keeping that close to the chest. But looking at the picture, he definitely looks a little bit on the older side. And so my point here is, if you are a fully fledged adult, if you are over the age of 20, then you have no idea what the youths are saying these days. You have no idea what's going on. And so don't try to force what you think is happening into their dialogue, because it just feels awkward. It just feels dated. Like, there's a point very early in the beginning, I think this is like the catalyst of the film. This is when Alice, the young daughter, she's 14 years old, she has a fake ID, and she sneaks into a club, and obviously Jamie Foxx and Cameron Diaz figure out her location, find her, and take her home, and there's a part where they're in the garage, and Cameron Diaz and Alice are getting into it, and Alice says, "You're so fake," which again, that is a term that is used, but not nearly as often as it was, say, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And then McKenna Roberts, that's the actress's name, sorry, the character is Alice, she storms off saying, "I can't even with you right now." Again, not as common of a phrase as it was 5-10 years ago, okay? And then when they're in the club itself, we've got the club goers, the what would the proper term be? I don't know. I don't know what age these guys are because they look like they're kind of old. They could be old actors attempting to play young people, but I don't know. In any case, they're in the club, and Jamie Foxx and Cameron Diaz show up, and they're like, "Okay, boomer, time to leave." Okay, boomer, first of all, is not really a Gen Z meme. Okay, boomer is like a millennial meme, first of all. Like, we all know what that means, we all understand the point and the premise, but people who are in Gen Z do not often say, okay, boomer. And they call her a Karen as well, which is, again, that is not, like, as common parlance anymore. Like, that's old hat stuff. Like, we would have said, Karens were popular in, like, 2020, in, like, 2018, but that term has gone by the wayside. Of course, people still refer to people as Karens, but not as often. Like, you are not, in an attempt to try and appear as though you are up to date with the youths, it ultimately just feels more old. And maybe part of that is the point of the story, right? One of the main functions of this is that they are, Jamie Foxx and Cameron Diaz are, Gen X people trying to connect with their Gen Z adults, but it just doesn't work. It just feels awkward. Now, I will say, as we get further into the movie, it becomes less evident and less obvious that they are trying to appeal to this young demographic. It's mostly just in this setup area where we're trying to establish the conflict between mother and daughter and, Gen X and Gen Z. It's really only in the beginning where we see it, but it's just out of place and it feels awkward. Now, like I said, I enjoy the family dynamic. Of course, we explore it through Emily and Alice, the mother and daughter, but then we also get to see it a further generation back between Cameron Diaz's Emily and her mother, Ginny, who is played by Glenn Close. And I like their interaction as well, but I think I really only like their interaction as it's put next to the relationship between Alice and, I already forgot her name, Emily, between the younger mother and daughter. And I think that is because, it's these two opposites, these two polar opposites, right? So Cameron Diaz, as we learn throughout the film, she grew up in basically an empty house because her mother was also a spy, and so she was constantly out on assignment in Beirut, I think is one of the places they name, but just all over the world, constantly working, never at home. And so because of that, they're obviously very distant, and they don't have any relationship there whatsoever, and Cameron Diaz harbors this resentment against Glenn Close. And then we see the literal inversion of that, right, when Cameron Diaz has her own kids. She tries to way overcompensate and provide the childhood for her kids that she didn't get herself, and so she is constantly there. I don't know if they... I know they say the term helicopter parents in here, but I can't remember if it's like Cameron Diaz saying, see, we need to be more involved in our lives, or what's happening. But the point is, she is constantly there, and that is one of the things that causes the friction between her and Alice, because Alice says that she is, when Cameron Diaz is upset with her, Alice says, you're just mad because I'm living my life and not yours. And I think that's an interesting dynamic to have these three generations sort of all deal with their family problems themselves. Now, like I said in the beginning, I enjoyed a lot of the action pieces. I thought they were fun. I mean, there was nothing too necessarily over the top or crazy about them. There was nothing too mind-blowing. But like I said, I enjoy when we're watching a spy movie and any action movie, but specifically spy movies, and the heroes have to use, improvised weapons to beat the bad guys. I think it's always fun to me. And I think it's a good place for some interesting, some creative choices to be made by the writer and the director and stuff. And I think that was more or less well done here. In the beginning, I wish there's an opening fight scene on a plane that I wish had a little bit more of the creative use of surroundings going on. I think it does an okay job, but it sort of drops the ball there. But one complaint that I do have about the action set pieces in this movie applies to a lot of sort of the modern action comedies, action movies that we've seen lately. And it's this use of like music that is supposed to be like the opposite. It's this, like, they build this level of irony with this beautiful music playing in the background to sort of distract from the savagery of the violence that's going on. And I don't necessarily really like that trend. I think there are some ways where it can be done well, but I think more often than not, it just feels weird and out of place. And that's not on a comment on like the use of the choice of music, right? Because I'm a big fan of a lot of the music that they use in this movie. I'm a big fan of the soundtrack, and the first one doesn't apply to a fight scene, but I think it's worth mentioning. It's Doo-Wop by Ms. Lauryn Hill, which longtime listeners of the podcast, people who were listening back in the old days, may remember that I'm a huge fan of Ms. Lauryn Hill. But then in the airplane scene that I mentioned a little bit ago, I think it's Ain't That a Kick in the Head by Dean Martin, which again, another great song. Dean Martin, one of the all-time greats. What a great, would you consider it big band or swing? I don't know, but in any case, what a great artist, and it's an amazing song. But I just feel like it feels out of place in fight scenes, and that is a little even more on the nose because he's singing Ain't That a Kick in the Head, and Cameron Diaz and Jamie Foxx are literally kicking people in the head. It's like, all right, I get it. And then later on in the movie, I believe this is towards in the final act of the movie, after the children have been kidnapped, which, I mean, well, this is a spoiler section, but let's be honest, it's a family movie about former spies. If the kids aren't going to be kidnapped, then what's the point of the movie, you know? But they use, I think it's Etta James' At Last, which again, a great song, but I just don't necessarily really like that style of editing and sound design. I don't know. It always sticks out to me. It always, I shouldn't say always. It always sticks out, but it almost always, pulls me out of the movie. I don't know. That's just maybe a personal quirk. Maybe you guys feel differently and like that style, that choice, but that's just me. Now, one thing I mentioned earlier when I was talking about Andrew Scott, that I felt like he was underutilized, and he was more just a vehicle to sort of attempt to move the plot forward and insinuate this conflict. Now, in the very beginning, we see Andrew Scott, whose name in the show I can't remember, Baron, that's right. We see him greet Jamie Foxx and Cameron Diaz on the tarmac. He's going to provide them with a getaway plane. And it's there's some fun back and forth there between Jamie Foxx. I don't know if that's a scene where maybe the line delivery isn't exactly great, or whatever, but it's all right. It gets the job done. It gets across the point of establishing the relationship and the pseudo love triangle between these three people. But it's just awkward. And so they're on the plane, and some, goons basically take over the plane, yada yada, the whole plot of the movie set in motion. And then we flash forward, 15 years, and like I said, the cover gets blown, and so Jamie Foxx and Cameron Diaz have to jet over to England to try and retrieve a thing so that they can, basically prove their innocence, leverage to have their regular lives returned, blah, blah, blah. Go after the MacGuffin, standard spy movie stuff. And then that's where we really get to see a little bit more of Andrew Scott, because again, he's an MI6 agent. They're in London, and so he is tracking them. But they do this thing throughout the show, throughout the movie, where, like, early on, Kyle Chandler says that it's probably Baron who sold us out. He's a bad guy. And then throughout the entire movie, they spend so long trying to make him look evil. And it's so obvious where it's like, okay, this is right in your face, and this is a spy movie, so there's obviously going to be double crosses. This guy's clean. He's not really in on this. He's just doing his job. But they spend so long trying to build him up as this, like, evil guy. And in the end, it really doesn't come to anything. In the end, when we find out that the person who has set all this in motion and is going after Jamie Foxx and Cameron Diaz isn't Baron, but it's Kyle Chandler, who plays a guy named Chuck and who was their former handler when they were CIA assets. He double-crossed them, and he pointed the finger at Andrew Scott so that our heroes, wouldn't trust him and wouldn't want to work with him and would constantly try and run away and continue to make themselves look guilty, right? And then after that happens, it's like they just completely ignore the fact that they spent an hour or however long making this guy look like the bad guy. It feels like a dropped plot point. He's making phone calls, he's acting suspicious, he's getting phone calls, and he's acting more suspicious. And in the end, it feels like it just ultimately turns into nothing, and it's like not really resolved. And I think maybe part of that is because they're trying to set up like the very final scene of the movie where he shows up at Jamie Foxx's daughter's soccer game, hiding in the parents' car, and is like, I need you to help me find your father, and set up a sequel. It just feels like a dropped plot point. I don't know if that was necessarily written so well. And like I said, I think it's just so on the nose. It's so obvious that they're trying to make this guy appear bad that it's like there's really no mystery involved. Of course, the mystery then is, okay, well, who is the real bad guy? But it isn't... I don't know. I don't think it necessarily worked that well. I felt like that is a situation where the writing was poor. Now, who is the real bad guy? I asked the question, and like I mentioned earlier, it turns out that it is Kyle Chandler, it is Chuck, and again, this is an area where I feel like they dropped the ball a little bit, and they could have explained this a little bit more. I mean, obviously he gets a scene where he goes over his villain monologue and describes how and why he was evil and turned against them or whatever. And he reveals that it's because after what happened on the plane with Jamie Foxx and Cameron Diaz, Kyle Chandler had to take the heat because of the, bureaucracy of the CIA. And because of that, he was pushed out of his job. He ended up losing his wife and all this. And like, that's really all we get. We just get like the one scene. And so it feels like an incredibly fast turnaround from this guy who was, in the beginning, their friend, their handler, and apparently knows them fairly well because they have some fun back and forth when he realizes that Jamie Foxx and Cameron Diaz are in like a little bit of a relationship. There's some fun moments, but then it's just such a quick turnaround. It's just such a quick turnaround, and it feels like it just feels a little bit like lazy writing. Like they were like, okay, we know this guy's the bad guy. We set him up as the good guy in the beginning, so how do we turn that around? How do we make this make sense? And they came up with literally the most basic answer they could. Literally the most basic answer they could. I mean, how long did they spend on it? 30 seconds coming up with the reason for this guy becoming a villain? It seems to me like the kind of thing where they were like, they had decided that this guy was going to be the villain, and they had gone through like a lot of the writing process, and then they were like, oh man, we got to explain how this guy becomes a villain. And so they write in, one paragraph where Kyle Chandler gives his whole life story or whatever. But that being said, I mean, as much as I don't necessarily like the writing of the character, I think Kyle Chandler's performance is fairly decent. Not as amazing as I would have hoped, but there's a question, could he have done better with better writing and better direction? I think the answer is almost certainly yes. But it was a little bit disappointing to see him in this movie in such an unamazing fashion. As I mentioned on my review for Green Lantern Fractured Spectrum, the reason that I decided to watch this movie is because I hadn't really seen much of Kyle Chandler's work, and so I wanted to get a little bit more familiar with him. And so he's the reason that I decided to watch this movie in the first place, and it wasn't amazing. But like I said, his acting I felt was decent, and so it wasn't so bad that it necessarily turned me off from being excited for the Lantern show. It's going to take a lot more than that to make me unexcited for it. But it was just awkward, and it felt kind of weird. There are some other things in this movie that I didn't necessarily like and felt awkward and weird, and that's this character Nigel, who's played by what's his name, Jamie. I don't know, something, there's a lot of vowels. It's Demetriou. I don't know, whatever. French, maybe. In any case, I felt like the character was more or less okay. But again, like a one-sided, literally just comedic relief. In a movie that is literally an action comedy, I don't know if we need a character like this whose sole purpose is just to be comedic relief. He's like the fool triumphant character. He is in a relationship with Glenn Close, so there's like a 30-year age gap or something, and that makes for some awkward scenes but some funny scenes. But he is just a character who stumbles and bumbles his way through the entire movie until the end, when he eventually does the thing that ends up saving the day or whatever. And I felt like a lot of his stuff was way, way overacted. Way overacted. Like I said, there are some funny moments there, but it was just way over the top sometimes, where I was like, okay, I don't like this. I don't like what's going on. I think if you had toned it down a little bit, I think it would have landed a little bit more. But the over-the-top thing is what they were going for. Based off of the writing and his acting and all of the movements he made, it was definitely a choice, and it's not a choice that I really, really enjoy. But Glenn Close in this, like I said, is the partner of Nigel and the mother of Cameron Diaz, and obviously it's Glenn Close. I think she did a good job. The interaction that she has with Cameron Diaz's daughter, I think, is really, really good. I really enjoyed it, and we get this moment of clarity, the calm before the storm, I suppose, where Glenn Close has a heart-to-heart with the daughter and explains to her, like, mothers and daughters fight, we butt heads, but we love each other, blah, blah, blah. And that is the scene where Alice really starts to change her mind and the way that she views her mom, and realizes that she doesn't hate her. Or maybe realizes isn't the proper word, but she realizes that it looks like she hates her mom, and that's not how she feels, right? She may be angry or whatever, they may butt heads, but she loves her, and she's learning that her mom would do anything for her. And I think that that's really nice, and that scene could have been done horribly if it weren't for Glenn Close. Again, though, another scene where I felt like the writing was awkward, right? There's two sentences in a row where she, ends the sentence with questions. It's something like, I wasn't around much, was I? No, it's not something like that. But I think, I don't remember. I know one of the things she says is, and that didn't leave much time for her, did it? Which again is, it's a fine point, but it's like, it's very on the nose that, you are trying to educate your granddaughter here. And it's the kind of thing where I'm like, okay, this isn't really how people talk. Even though she is supposed to be this, uppity British lady who is too good for hugs, and it's not very posh and polite to be so close and friendly and openly loving with people. But it just felt weird. It felt weird. I don't know. But in any case, I want to say one final thing here, and I sort of ragged a little bit on Cameron Diaz throughout the entirety of this video. Like I said, I think she was one of the worst parts. Worst is not the way I should say that, because she wasn't terrible, but more often than other people, I felt like her line reads were not very good. But there was one part that I definitely enjoyed. It made me laugh. So it is after the catalyst scene when they, yank their daughter out of the club, and they're back in their bedroom, and Cameron Diaz is like, "That was insane, right?" And Jamie Foxx says, "Yeah, it was insane." And she goes, "Like a good insane, like a bad insane, or like a good insane?" And he goes, "Definitely bad." And she talks about how, it was one of the only times she's felt alive in so long, and how she sometimes misses the old days. And then there's a joke where she's like, "Don't you ever wonder about jetting down to South America and stopping a coup or starting a coup? Whatever happens, I'm just in the mood for some good old-fashioned cooing." And I thought that was funny. Obviously, I think it's funny because, I don't exactly have a favorable view towards a lot of the actions of the intel agencies and stuff, but it was a fun, self-aware kind of thing, and I felt like it was delivered okay. But I don't know. Throughout it, she's got some really, really awkward line reads. I have seen some people saying that, like, the chemistry between Jamie Foxx and Cameron Diaz isn't good. I'll agree to that to some extent, but in large part, I think it's okay. I think the chemistry is off just because of some of the writing and line reads sometimes. But I think, you definitely get the sense throughout this that they are in a deeply involved marriage, and they not only do they love each other, but like they like each other, right? Like they're friends, and they have this air about them that sort of smooths over the awkward and tough parts. And I think a lot of that is assisted by the fact that it's Jamie Foxx, and he's funny. He's great. He's got such good comedic timing, and I think he's definitely probably the strongest part of this movie is the comedic aspects with Jamie Foxx. I think all in all, he's always great, and it was good to see him in this. But I think that we are going to leave things there. We're about out of time. So again, let me know down in the comments what you guys thought of this movie. Again, I'll repeat, it's not amazing. It's not the best movie of the year. It's probably not even going to be the best spy movie of the year. Probably not the best action comedy of the year. But certainly enjoyable. Like I said, it's a good popcorn flick, just something to put on while you're doing something else or whatever. But let me know if you guys disagree or agree with that. And let's see. I'm going to be back here Thursday. I'm taking Shayde's slot over. I'm going to be reviewing Superman, the Lex Luthor special. I'm excited for that. I'm a big fan of Lex Luthor, and this comic has some really interesting stuff going on. You'll have to stick around till Thursday to hear my full thoughts. And I will also be back here next Tuesday to review Rebel Ridge, starring Aaron Pierre, the other half of the Lantern's main cast. Aaron Pierre will be John Stewart, and in this he is a Marine, and I enjoyed that one as well. But to hear my full thoughts, of course, you will have to wait. But in any case, we're going to leave it there, and I will see you guys next time.